I'm Sceery. This video that I made many years ago demonstrates the proper sounds and methods for calling deer. It's sure to make your next hunt a great success.
Welcome to Ed Sceery's Outdoor Classroom. Ed is owner of Sceery Game Calls in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He holds a PhD in animal science and is nationally known for his work in wildlife communication. He's a licensed outfitter and experienced big game hunter. Sit back and get comfortable as Ed reviews how to use Sceery deer calls.
Deer are the most sought-after big game animals in North America. Every year, millions of hunters go out in search of their trophy. Hi, I'm Ed Sceery. Today I'm going to talk about deer calls and how you can use deer calls to make your next hunt a great success. Deer calls are easy to learn how to use and how to blow. They can be effective tools to help you increase the success on your deer hunts. To give you an idea of how successful you can be, let me mention a deer hunt my partner and I went on in Nebraska a few years ago. We hunted deer for 2.5 days, mostly in the mornings. And we'd set up and we'd use our calls to attract deer. During the 2.5 days, we attracted or called over 20 deer to our location. Now the final count I think was about 26 deer. They were hard to keep track of and count because we called so many. But you can have that kind of success too if you learn how to use deer calls effectively and you hunt in an area where there's a good population of deer. Both bucks and does will respond to the sounds of deer calls, and it's not uncommon for you to be able to call the same deer back several times in a row. Very often what we see is we call a deer in close within 10 or 20 feet of us, We keep the brim of our cap low to avoid making eye contact, and the deer will come very, very close, stomp its feet, and snort at you trying to get some kind of response. If you sit there and you don't move and you're as quiet as you can be, the deer will finally get tired of standing there watching you. It'll turn and leave. If you pick up a deer call and blow it softly as the deer's leaving, what we see a lot of times is the deer will turn around and charge right back to you. It's not uncommon for us to do this with one deer 4 or 5 times over a period of about 10 minutes. Many deer hunters who've never used deer calls have some question or doubt whether they really work as good as we say they will. Well, they really work great, but what you have to do is you have to develop some confidence in your ability to use deer calls and to call deer. So what I'd encourage you to do is learn the basic techniques that we try to teach you and go out and spend some time in the field practicing with your deer calls, and you'll find that in fact they do work good. And once you see how they work, what you'll do is you'll develop some confidence, and you'll go back time and time again, and your luck will increase all the time. The name of the game when we're calling deer or calling any game animals with game calls is persistence. You have to be a diehard and keep at it until you succeed. Whether you're hunting in the western states for mule deer, or in the eastern states for whitetail, or in the northwest for blacktail deer, the basic habits of deer are all quite similar. So it's not necessary to make any major changes in the tactics that you use to hunt these different deer. Any major changes in tactics that we do use are based on the differences in the terrain of the area that we're hunting. An example of this would be when we're hunting for eastern whitetail, generally we use tree stands. And the reason we do this is because the eastern hardwood and pine forests are so thick that you can't see deer when you're sitting on the ground. When we're in the western states hunting mule deer, generally the country is a lot wider open where you can see deer from a long distance, and so we don't need to use tree stands. Now you could use them if you wanted to, but they wouldn't be necessary. So remember, the habits of most of the deer are quite similar, and only change your deer hunting technique based on the differences in the terrain of the area. One of the keys to successfully calling deer is the number of deer in the area. If you want to call a lot of deer, you have to choose an area that has a high concentration and a high population of deer. The more deer in the area, the more deer you will call. If you use deer calls in an area that does not have a lot of deer, don't expect to call a lot of deer. Now this holds true when you're deer calling, elk calling, or predator calling. The more animals in the area, the more animals that you can expect to call. A lot of hunters believe that whitetail deer are much more responsive to deer calls than mule deer. Well, there may be some truth to this, but you have to remember that the concentrations and numbers of whitetail deer are much greater. And when we go to hunt whitetail deer, typically when we blow on a call, there's a much greater probability that a whitetail deer will hear the call and respond to it. If we hunt mule deer in the more wide open spaces of the West, there's not as many deer in the area, and there's not as many deer that can hear the call. One of the reasons that deer are such a challenge to hunt is because they're very wary animals with excellent senses. Their sense of eyesight, hearing, and smell, it's much greater than yours or mine. It's only the lucky hunter that accidentally stumbles across a big buck. In order to use deer calls successfully, you have to use common sense, good judgment, and use good hunting techniques. A deer call is not going to make up for poor hunting techniques. Those hunters who have a good understanding of deer and who have developed good hunting skills will most likely have the best luck with their deer calls. It's important for you to learn the animal's habits and put this knowledge to work for you during your hunts. Although deer calls will work at any time of the day, early morning and late afternoon are the times when deer are most active, and as a result of this, these are the hours that deer calling will be most effective for you. I'd suggest you begin your calling as soon as it's light enough to hunt. If you're not successful the first time you try, don't give up. Remember, the name of the game is persistence. I don't know of any kind of game calling that you can expect success every time you try. One of the main ingredients to deer calling is being persistent. You just have to keep at it until you succeed. Deer, similar to many other animals, are territorial, and they generally spend their entire lives within a relatively small area. The size of the area is dependent on the available food, water, and cover. These are the necessities of life. Many white-tailed deer will spend their entire lives in a territory as small as one section of land or 640 acres. Mule deer, on the other hand, generally have much larger territories. The easiest way I know for a hunter to learn about the territorial behavior of deer is to dress up warm on a cold, snowy day in the winter and trail deer all day long. What you'll find is they don't typically move very far. Generally, they wander around within a relatively small area. But you can learn that firsthand if you go follow some deer in the snow. One important point I'd like to make is that you can learn a heck of a lot about deer by spending some time in the field just watching and observing them. You don't learn nearly as much when you're hunting deer as you do just when you're out spending time watching the deer and studying their behavior. If you want to become a better deer hunter, spend as much time as you can with a good spotting scope or a pair of binoculars and watch deer during their daily activities. If you have the chance outside of hunting season, spend some time stalking deer. See how close you can get to them without spooking them. These out-of-season activities will make you a much better deer hunter when deer hunting season arrives. Let's talk about pre-hunt scouting. I think it's really important for you to spend as much time as you can out in the field scouting an area prior to your hunt. Look for their trails, their beds, their watering, and their feeding sites. Also look for rubs and scrapes that the bucks use to identify and mark their territory. If you're out to bag a trophy buck, go to areas that have produced trophy bucks in the recent past. We can assume that if an area is producing trophy bucks, that the animals in the area have both the genetics and the nutrition needed to grow large racks. In heavily hunted areas where the bucks get a lot of pressure, generally they don't live long enough to obtain the age necessary for large antler development. Following the breeding season, and with the change of daylight hours as spring approaches, the bucks will shed their antlers. Searching an area for cast-off antlers from the previous year can give you a good idea of the size of the racks produced in the area. From the time the breeding season ends until the following fall, the bucks will separate and remain separated from the females. One of the best ways to locate bucks is to search for fresh scrapes and rubs early in the fall. As bucks tend to use the same areas year after year, you may want to begin your scouting during the summer looking for scrapes and rubs from the previous fall. Keep your eyes open for bushes and tree branches that have had their bark rubbed off. These are easy to find as the branches dry out and the wood turns a light color. Without knowing that bucks are in the area and just picking out an area to hunt at random, you can't expect to have very good luck with your deer calls. If you're after a buck and you're going to call a buck in with your deer calls, it's a good idea to know that there's bucks in the area you plan to hunt. Just prior to the breeding season, bucks normally make many scrapes and rubs in their territory, and they return to these sites on a regular basis. Knowing that a buck is nearby is a very important part of successful deer calling. While bucks are very wary and secretive during most of the year, just prior to and during the rut, bucks cast all caution to the wind and generally don't have much other than breeding on their mind. Let's review what we know about deer vocalizations and how deers use sounds to communicate. Deer are very vocal animals and make a lot of different sounds. Many experienced hunters are familiar with some of these sounds, and some hunters may not have ever heard any of them. Those of you that were raised on farms or ranches around domestic livestock will have a big head start in understanding how deer communicate. Domestic cattle and sheep and wild elk and deer are all split-hooved ruminant animals. They're all very closely related species, and they communicate in a very similar manner. One of the big keys to understanding deer vocalizations and how deer communicate is understanding that they don't have a lot to say to each other. They don't communicate in words like humans. Basically, all deer do is communicate their feeling at the time, their mood or their emotion. That's all that they can communicate to another deer. Soft, quiet vocalizations relay the message to other nearby deer that they're calm. When a deer gets more excited, it will make a more excited vocalization, a higher level of intensity, and it will relate that message to nearby deer. Very excited deer will relay a very intense message and relay a very important message to other nearby deer. When deer communicate with vocalizations, they can do it in two ways. They do it with the intensity of the sound, and they do it with the repetition of the same sound. A calm deer will communicate in a calm vocalization to other nearby deer. If it wants to strengthen that particular vocalization, it will repeat it several times. An excited deer will make a vocalization that sounds excited, loud, coarse, and if they want to reinforce that particular sound or that particular message, they repeat the same sound over several times. Deer fawns are small young animals, and the pitch of their voice is high. This is the same as young humans or the young of other animals. The younger the animal, the higher pitch their voice. Deer fawns can basically only communicate with one sound. They vary their communication by the intensity that they make that sound and the number of repetitions that they make the sound. Low-intensity sounds that fawns make do not require much effort to make. They're not very loud, and they're cohesive sounds, which means to draw animals together. Low-intensity sounds of a fawn are called a bleat. Let me demonstrate a bleat to you. They're soft, quiet sounds. More intense sounds of a fawn will relay a more excited feeling. They will be louder sounds, more frequent, and relay an excited message to other nearby deer. The most intense sound that a fawn will make, we call it a distress cry. It's basically a fawn bleat, but it's made with a lot more effort. And so let me show you how to do that. Now this again is a quiet, soft bleat. If the deer becomes more excited, it will sound like this. If it becomes truly excited, is in danger of being attacked by another animal, it will make what we call a distress cry, which is just a more intense bleat. And so basically that's the sounds that fawns make. They make quiet, low intense bleats, or they make more intense sounds, which we call distress cries. That's a soft, quiet, cohesive sound which will draw animals to it. This is a real intense sound, distress sound made by a fawn, which will elicit a protective instinct of nearby deer, and they will come to the sound of a fawn screaming. A mother deer will come to the soft, quiet bleats of her young like this. Just as a cohesive sound draw calm animals together, a real intense sound from a fawn, a distress cry, will arouse the protective instincts of adult deer and attract them. You can make a low-intensity deer bleating sound with the new buck slammer call, real high-pitched cohesive sound. Remember, I want you to keep the pitch on these cohesive sounds going from high to low. Real soft is the best. So when you make a fawn bleat, make it as softly and as quietly as you can. The dynamite thing about the buck slammer call is it can dramatically improve the success of your hunt, because with this call you can stop and position a deer anywhere you want to. Typically when you've got a deer in close, it's hard to get a good shot without the deer moving behind trees or if he's out of your shooting lane. But with the buck slammer call, you can put it in the corner of your mouth and draw your bow or put the crosshairs of your rifle on a deer, and at the exact point that you want the deer to stop and look at you, you blow on the call. Now normally what I do is put it in the corner of my mouth. When I draw a bow, I draw the bow. When I have the deer exactly where I want him, I blow on the slammer call, the deer will stop and give me a real good clean standing shot. Release the arrow. When making distress cries, you're basically making the same sound as a bleat. You're just using a lot more air and making it a lot more intense. Just blow through the call and change your hand over the end of it, muffle it, and then open it up to make the sound a lot more realistic like this. Normally when we call deer with distress cries, we'll blow a series of distress cries, and we'll sit quietly and watch the area for up to 5 or 10 minutes before we make another series of cries, and keep at this for 20 or 30 minutes, giving nearby deer plenty of time to respond. And what you're going to find is a lot of times you'll have deer show up within 30 seconds or a minute from the time you first blow on your deer call to produce deer distress sounds. The buck slammer call can give you a great advantage when you're deer hunting. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're in a tree stand calling deer or you're still hunting from the ground or stalking deer. You can still use this call to your advantage by stopping and turning deer for a good standing shot anytime you need one. Adult deer, similar to young deer and other ruminant animals, do not have a wide vocabulary and cannot relay complicated messages to other deer. The only thing that they can relay to other deer is their feelings, their mood, or their emotions. And again, similar to a young deer, they only do this by changing the intensity of the sounds that they produce and the repetitions of the sound. In humans, as we grow older and we mature, our voice changes from smooth and high pitch to lower and coarser. Well, the same pattern holds true with deer and other wild animals. In deer, what once was a soft, smooth bleat call or bleating vocalization is now a coarse, rough grunting sound. Let me demonstrate this to you. Now, in a fawn, the sound that they make is this. That's a bleating sound, and remember, they can make it with different levels of intensity. In an adult, the sound becomes a grunt. It's the same sound, but now we call it a grunt because it's lower and coarser, and it sounds like this. Again, in a fawn. In the adult. Okay, now adult deer, similar to humans, the adult male has a lower, coarser voice than the adult female. And this holds true generally throughout the animal kingdom. So we want to make a coarse, low-pitched grunt, blow on the call like that. If you want a little smoother, higher-pitched grunt, try it again. If you want to change the grunting sounds, the pitch of the grunt, on this call you can shorten or lengthen the grunt tube and it will change the resonance of the sound. Let me show you that. So you can change the pitch of the grunting sound if you like. Again, for coarse grunts of a buck, hold the barrel out extended, muffle the end of the call, and blow very lightly on it. For a doe, you inhale this on this call. The breeding season or the rut of deer generally lasts from about mid-November to the end of the year, but the exact time varies quite a bit from one area of the country to the other. If you're not sure of the time of the rut in your area, it'd be a good idea for you to find out by asking a local game warden or another experienced hunter in your area. They'll know exactly when the peak of the rut is in the area you plan to hunt. One of the keys to successful deer hunting is understanding buck behavior during the rut and how bucks react to grunting sounds. Loud, coarse, aggressive grunts by the adult male are made during the rut or the pre-rut and the rut period. And these are sounds made to challenge other nearby bucks for dominance and for females in the area. And they make those like this. These are louder, more intense grunts than the softer, quieter, cohesive grunts of an adult male. Should a buck hear the grunting sounds of another buck in his territory during the pre-rut period or during the rut, his immediate response is to go search out the source of those sounds to identify the buck who has invaded his territory. Make a few low, coarse grunting sounds, and then sit still, watching the area for an approaching buck. Now remember, it's a natural instinct of a buck to approach the source of the grunting sounds. He'll believe you're a buck who's invaded his territory, and he'll approach you. So sit still and quiet and wait for his approach. You may want to combine an adult buck and an adult doe call like this. Some coarse, low-pitched grunts of an adult buck. Or you may want to combine some adult grunts and a deer fawn bleat. And by combining these different calls, the temptation for a nearby buck to respond will even be greater. Try not to make the grunts excessively loud. Remember, deer can hear much better than you can, and they'll hear the quiet grunts from quite a long way off, so they don't have to be loud for them to be effective. Quiet grunts will work just fine for you. Let's talk about snorts of the adult deer. Well, a snort is a very alert sound made by a deer. It's a high-intensity sound made by a rapid force of air, and it sounds like this. A deer normally will make a snort when they're alarmed by something. Typically, a hunter will hear a snort if he's walking through the forest and he accidentally walks too close to a deer. He startles the deer, and as a response, the deer will make a loud snort. We call it an alert snort. The idea of the snort is to alert other deer in the area of nearby danger. Now, a hunter can use that type of snort if you're on a drive and you're trying to flush deer out of an area. That kind of an alert snort will do that for you. It's certainly not something you want to try to call a deer with. Now, there's another kind of snort that will help you in calling deer, and typically we use this along with antler rattling, and it's called a snort wheeze. And how deer make this, a buck will make 2 or 3 short snorts followed by a wheeze, and it sounds like this. So if you're in the middle of antler rattling and you want to add a little realism to your rattling, clash your rattling antlers together and make a snort wheeze like that. And that will improve the luck that you have from antler rattling. Well, I guess it's time we headed out. I want to encourage you to spend some time in the field studying deer and learning deer behavior. I'm confident that if you learn deer behavior, use good hunting techniques, and the basics of calling deer with deer calls, you'll have success on your next hunt. Before I go, I want to remind you to follow your local game and fish laws, respect the rights of private property owners, and above all, be careful with your firearms and other weapons. This is Ed Sceery with Sceery Game Calls in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I wish you the best of luck on all your hunts. Adios.
For more information about Sceery game calls and hunting products, check your local sporting goods supplier or phone toll-free 1-800-327-4322. Sceery is your only source for premium outfitter-grade game calls.